Behind the smooth, polished desk of late-night television's most trusted host, chaos often waited just behind the curtain. For over 30 years, The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, was the most consistent ritual in American television. The blue curtain, the sharp monologue, the effortless banter. Johnny Carson made the surreal feel ordinary, but for all the comfort it offered millions of viewers, few knew how unpredictable, sometimes dangerous, the show really was behind the scenes. Because at the peak of its popularity, The Tonight Show wasn't just where celebrities came to promote movies or albums, it was a pressure cooker, and sometimes those celebrities showed up completely out of their minds. A quiet system developed backstage to manage the madness. Subtle code phrases, signal gestures, Plan Bs whispered in the control room. If Carson touched his tie during an introduction, it was a signal. This guest might be impaired. If he tapped his cue cards twice, the director knew to keep the shot simple and the segment tight. It wasn't paranoia, it was protocol. And it existed for one reason. Some of the world's most beloved entertainers were walking out on stage high, drunk or both. While the cameras rolled, Johnny would smile. He would nod, laugh, and guide his guests through whatever mess they brought with them. But behind his cool exterior, his team was constantly working to prevent disaster, and sometimes it was just barely avoided. These are the wildest, strangest, and most infamous appearances of Tonight Show guests who arrived under the influence. Some handled it gracefully, others crashed and burned, and through it all, Carson never lost his grip on the audience or the show, but he never forgot the chaos that came with it. Let's begin with the guest who hid nothing and somehow made it work. George Carlin didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. In the 1960s, he'd been a clean-cut, buttoned-up comic, but by the 1970s, he had transformed into something completely different. A counterculture prophet with long hair, political fire, and a visible fondness for cannabis. Carlin was a Tonight Show regular, over 130 appearances. His brilliance wasn't just accepted, it was expected. And if he looked a little glazed over, as one camera operator put it, that was just George being George. He never showed up belligerent. He didn't slur. He didn't stumble. But it was obvious to anyone paying attention that Carlin wasn't entirely sober, and Johnny Carson knew it. The two had a quiet understanding. Carlin would show up with his creative edge, and Carson would give him space to riff. Was I usually stoned on The Tonight Show in the 70s? Carlin later wrote in his autobiography, "Of course I was. It was the 70s, and I was George Carlin. Do the math." What separated Carlin from others was that he was still sharp, still fast. His mind remained a machine, just one operating on a slightly different frequency. Carson never invited him to guest host, perhaps because of that same unpredictability. But he kept bringing him back, because even high, Carlin delivered better than most sober comics could dream of. He was a functioning herbalist, as one producer put it. A guest you could trust, mostly, but not everyone was as contained. If Carlin represented controlled chaos, Richard Pryor was something else entirely. He was lightning in a bottle, brilliant, fearless, and completely unpredictable. Pryor's relationship with substances was well known, and by the late 1970s, his cocaine use was becoming impossible to ignore. One night in 1978, it all came out on air. He started off sharp, funny, riffing on childhood memories. But then his eyes changed. His rhythm faltered. His thoughts began to drift. The audience wasn't sure if they were watching comedy or a slow unraveling. Carson saw it instantly. He shifted into crisis mode, changing topics, redirecting the energy, and gently covering for Pryor's sudden incoherence. It was masterful. Johnny was like a traffic cop that night, recalled a stage manager. He had to direct Richard's energy, steer it somewhere safe, and somehow make it all feel natural. Carson cared about Pryor. He didn't scold or exploit him, but he also didn't ignore the danger. When Pryor was off, the risk wasn't just dead air, it was derailment. And yet, the audience never saw the panic. They just saw a comedian and a host laughing and talking. Behind the scenes, though, everyone knew something wasn't right. Not every guest got the same forgiveness. One didn't even get invited back. Truman Capote had always been a sharp, provocative guest, witty, eccentric, and unpredictable in the best ways. But in 1980, he crossed a line. He walked onto The Tonight Show, set visibly slurring. His eyes drooped. His head would nod forward before snapping back like he was waking up from a nap. The control room panicked. "Cut to Johnny," the director whispered. "Just stay on Johnny." Carson smiled through it. He asked Capote softball questions, tried to keep the tone light, but it wasn't working. Capote could barely respond. His speech was a mess, his thoughts were scattered, and most troubling of all, he didn't seem to care. When the cameras cut to commercial, Carson stormed off stage. "Never again," he told the talent coordinator. "He's done." Capote was banned, one of the only guests to ever receive a permanent blacklisting from The Tonight Show. Carson didn't mind eccentricity, but what he couldn't tolerate was a guest who came unprepared, incoherent, and unprofessional. "Johnny didn't judge the substance," explained a former producer. "He judged the result." And Capote was a disaster. Some guests didn't hide their altered state and didn't have to. Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong were the stoner stereotype. Their comedy relied on it. And when they appeared on The Tonight Show, they didn't tone it down. They leaned in. They'd arrive giggling, half coherent, telling stories that meandered for minutes with no clear point. Carson didn't panic. He played along. He became the square, straight man, asking innocent questions that teed them up for punchlines. When Chong wandered into a long, disjointed anecdote about filming Up in Smoke, Carson just sat back, raised an eyebrow at the camera, and let the audience laugh. "He wasn't mocking them," said one staffer. "He was in on it." Carson didn't mind their enhancement because it was part of the act. And they delivered? The key difference? They were exactly who they appeared to be, and Johnny respected that. Peter Fonda's 1970 appearance is now legendary for all the wrong reasons. The star of Easy Rider and vocal advocate of psychedelics arrived on set with what crew members suspected was a full dose of LSD in his system. His pupils were huge. He stared at the lights. He looked at his hands like they were aliens. And then he started talking about time travel. 5 minutes in, Carson gave the signal. 2 taps on the cue cards. Cut to commercial. When the show returned, Fonda was gone, replaced with the next guest. No explanation, no goodbye. Carson wasn't angry. He told producers, give him another chance in a year. And Fonda did return, sober and articulate. But that night became Tonight Show folklore, a reminder of what happens when psychedelics meet primetime TV. British actor Oliver Reed was charming, bold, and absolutely unpredictable. On one 1975 appearance, he showed up visibly drunk. At first, it was just loud storytelling. Then came the shouting. Then, without warning, he stood up and assumed a fighting stance. The crew froze. Security crept toward the edge of the stage. Carson stayed seated, calm but alert. "He had zero tolerance for violence," said a former talent coordinator. "You could be drunk, but if you got aggressive, you were done." Carson cut the segment short. Reed was never invited back. Another name on the short list of permanent bans. Some appearances weren't confirmed, but the rumors never stopped. In 1974, Sammy Davis Jr. appeared on The Tonight Show, more energetic than anyone had seen before. Rapid-fire talking, sweating, constant movement. Crew members whispered about cocaine. Carson never said a word. He let Sammy go wild, interrupting himself, jumping from story to story. At the commercial break, Johnny simply wiped his brow and said, "I think I just got secondhand exhaustion. No scandal, no fallout, just another unforgettable night." Johnny Carson didn't care what you did before the show, as long as you could deliver once the cameras rolled. He had an internal system. If you were high but coherent, fine. If you were stoned but hilarious, no problem. But if you slurred, rambled, got hostile, or lost your grip on reality, you were gone. He believed in protecting guests, not humiliating them, in giving them a soft landing, not exploiting their fall. And somehow he made the wildest decade of live television look smooth. That's why Carson reigned for over 30 years. Because even when guests were high as a kite, Johnny never lost control of the room.